Welcome to Old Path Ministries in our study through the book of 1 Samuel. We're at chapter 16 and 17 today. Now, I've been looking forward to doing these chapters, but in getting ready for these things and reading through these chapters, because they're going to be presented at the same time, there are two events that we're all probably familiar with, but more than likely we're familiar with them kind of more in the Sunday school sense of things. And we might not even realize, unless you studied through the book of 1 Samuel and you're kind of familiar with the construct of it, you wouldn't even realize necessarily that these two chapters kind of like are right next to one another. And the transition is very, very quick here. And by the transition, I mean when it comes to the idea of the king. Now, what we're going to look at here, chapter 16 begins a section of 1 Samuel that really shows a major, major difference in the actual layout of the book, because the central figure, though Saul is going to be the king for most of it, for the rest of the book, for most of the rest of the book, I should say, the central figure, the person that has the most attention paid to him is actually David, because he is going to be anointed as the king. So that's what chapter 16 deals with. So as we look at that, we're going to see that David will be anointed as the king. We also find in chapter 17 is the David and Goliath story. And so, again, we think of both of those probably more like the children's ministry side of things, chapter 17 much more so than even 16, because it's David and Goliath, right? So sometimes we can maybe miss a little bit of what's here in really how David approaches him. And so these are, again, fascinating chapters when we take a look at the way that the nation is functioning. So before we get into the text, let me make a few observations, because I think that they're kind of helpful to us. Because especially chapter 17, so iconic. It is David and Goliath. But what we want to be able to remember is that this is now, Saul has already been told by Samuel on more than one occasion that God's done with you as the king. You have defied him once too often, and that's just from what we know about him. He's been king for some time now, but we know that already there are two major events that had taken place, and chapter 15 was really the end of it all when he did what he did with Agag and the Amalekites. And he was just defiantly wrong in what he had done. And so finally it was told to him that that was going to be the end of it. Now, we get the impression, and it's pretty obvious, by the time that chapter 16 rolls around, he's in a place of just kind of crisis, I guess you could say. And spiritually, he's not doing well whatsoever. And so it is in that backdrop that God is going to bring David into the picture, but he's not going to be seen as king that would be taking place, though he would have, I guess you could say, you're going to see the anointing of him will take place while Saul is still the king. These are people with incredible contrasts, and it doesn't take long to see those things. Now, there's not only the physical appearance, and there's a very interesting thing about that. Probably many of us are familiar with it, and I'll mention it when we get there, about God looking at the inward things and not the outward. But the contrast between David and Saul is not only one of physical things, but it is also one of spiritual things. And you see it just in the way that David approaches things. Of course, we're going to know as we study through his history, he had his moments of just horrible, fleshly, carnal things that were just grievous, sinful, and wicked. And yet, when it came to the things that he did, as far as, especially when he was approached about the things that he had done, this was a man who was contrite as far as his heart was concerned. He was tender towards the things of God, and this is why the Bible refers to him as a man after God's own heart. And so, though his outward things could sometimes betray him, inwardly this was a man who was deeply devoted to his God, and he loved him. So this person, if you were to stand Saul and David next to one another just by the physical ways that they are described, it says that David was he was handsome, and actually, depending on the translations, the idea that people would look at him as his countenance made him look somewhat delicate. He was red-haired and just young, youthful looking. Whereas Saul, it tells us that from his if he's in a crowd, he's shoulders above everyone. So from here up, like the tallest person came up to his shoulders. He looked the part. Spiritually, he was a disaster. And by contrast, spiritually, David was a completely different man, and yet he didn't have any of the physical attributes that Saul did. But we will also notice that by the time that chapter 17 rolls around, David's not concerned about his physical stature. And there are some things said about David in chapter 16 that really kind of takes away a little bit of the Sunday school kind of narrative that David went running out there in a light tunic kind of a thing, and he was looked like he was probably 13 and ran out there with a sling. There are some things about him that this was a man's man. David was a man's man, and we'll see that just by the description that's given. Though, by the time that you see the discussion that he has with Saul, Saul doesn't see him as such. What Saul knows about him is that this is a guy who can soothe Saul in all of his troubled mind and heart as a musician. And we'll see that's dedicated to chapter 16. But these men are a total contrast in every conceivable way, and they speak volumes in how man looks at things versus how God looks at things. And that's, again, brought up in the text. But stand them side by side, and you would look at Saul and say, he's the guy that looks the part. He looks stately. He looks manly. He looks like the leader of a country because he's bigger than everybody else. And yet inwardly, this was a man who had tremendous flaws spiritually and in every other conceivable way that we know of. By David, you would look at him and say he doesn't look anything like a king. But if Saul had what David had spiritually, man, oh man, you would have quite the composite, impressive man. So with all of that said, let's remember how chapter 15 leaves off. That Samuel has had to go to Saul and say, God's done with you. You're not going to be the king any longer. It's been given, your kingdom has been given to someone else. Now, again, it wasn't immediate, but as far as God was concerned, the man that God was going to choose, by contrast, again, because remember, this is God who is going to be introducing David. It's not because the people were tired of Saul. They weren't requiring his replacement. God was doing so. Even though God allowed them to have a king, that king had defied him one too many times, and God said, even the spirit that I had put upon him at the beginning is taken from him and is going to be given to David. We see that, and it's all right here in the text. So, though you have the king that the nation recognized, the king that God recognized was going to be in the very courts of the actual king as the nation saw him. So David would be serving Saul. And we get a glimpse in chapter 16 as to why, for really the rest of Saul's life, he's already been somewhat irrational and emotional and given over to fits of doing things without thinking it all the way through. Now he's going to the place of paranoia and, nowadays we would probably say to some degree, mental disease that you'll see. It's mentioned here. Of course, the language, as we read it in the English, makes it a little bit tough for us to understand, and I'll try to do my best to maybe work in what it seems that the text tells us that sounds a little different than what's in English. But chapter 16 is where we start, so let's turn there, chapter 16, and let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you as we gather together. We pray that your word would speak to our understanding in our hearts and minds, and that your spirit would lead us in our understanding of these things. There is much that we can understand and learn and apply to our own lives in this. Though it is the history of Israel and it is the history of the kings, yet there is so much that is here that is wise for us to understand. That how do we make application in the 21st century to the things that we see and how you interact with your people. So we thank you, and we pray that you would bless this time as we come together and we seek you in your word. We thank you in Jesus' name. All right, so chapter 16 begins this way. It says, now the Lord said to Samuel. So what we see here, Samuel is now, you can see this is troubling for Samuel, because he's told him, I'm not going to visit you any longer either. God is done, I'm done. Samuel has already said that to Saul. But it's not as though it was a clean break and it was easy for Samuel. So look at what it says. So the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul, seeing that I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? fill your horn with oil and go. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem, for I have provided myself a king among his sons. Okay, that makes it pretty easy. Samuel knows who he is, Samuel is. He knows what he's supposed to do, and he's always been one that, as God would give instruction and direction, Samuel was a godly man who would do as he was told to. You will notice here that he realizes that if I just do it as it's being said to me, that it could become perhaps problematic and troublesome. So he says this. Again, imagine if you're Samuel hearing this, the last sentence in verse 16, for I have provided myself a king among his sons. So clearly Samuel understands the importance of this and what would happen if this word got back to Saul. Samuel would be put to death. That would be a treasonous act kind of a thing. And yet it just shows that even these great men of God can become so human. Because isn't this funny that God says, here's what I'm telling you, go and do this. I'm going to appoint my next king. And here Samuel is afraid of a man. Well, if Saul hears about this, he'll kill me. And it's almost as though, and we do this, it's almost as though sometimes we forget that God knows all these things in advance. And would he actually send him into a place like that to do something as major as anointing a king, only to have it get wiped out before it even starts because Saul would kill Samuel? You see, as Samuel thinks of this, sometimes we might not think all these things through, but when God sends us and sends him, especially something like this, I mean, I got to be honest, I've been a believer for a long time, and I believe that there are a number of times when I've felt that my course of action is exactly what God wanted to do. But I've never had God say, here's what you're going to do, like directly communicate to me in a way that it's verbalized. And that's what's happening here. So somehow, some way, whether dream or whatever, God says directly to him, here's what I'm asking you to do. So in verse 2, Samuel said, how can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me. But the Lord said, take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. So exactly what you're going to do won't seem awful to anybody who hears it. If you say that you're going to Bethlehem to offer a sacrifice, go to Bethlehem and offer a sacrifice. It's not outside of your normal things to do. So it's not going to look suspicious. He tells him, go and do what I'm asking you to do. Take an offering with you, and you're going to go make a sacrifice in Bethlehem, which is exactly what he's going to do. God's not telling him to lie. God's telling him, do exactly what I'm telling you to do, and it won't look like anything else is going on. Verse 3. So then invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you will do. You shall anoint for me the one I name to you. So not only do you go there, but he's going to have him go through all the motions of this. And he won't anoint the person until God says that's the one. Okay, so we're pretty familiar with the story, I'm sure. So Samuel did what the Lord said, and he went to Bethlehem. And the elders of the town trembled at his coming and said, do you come peaceably? Like, what did we do? Kind of a thing. Samuel shows up unannounced. Usually it's kind of a bad thing, or at least in their minds it would be a bad thing because nobody asked him to come. Bethlehem's a pretty small place. Jerusalem's big. And of all the places in Israel, Bethlehem, kind of it's just an outskirt. It's within miles of Jerusalem. We visit it when we go and look at the shepherd's fields and all the things there. David, of course, would have been, this is his hometown. Well, in this case, he shows up, and so Samuel answers their question, verse 5, peaceably. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourself and come with me to the sacrifice. And then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. So this consecration or this sanctification, it's of course the ceremonial, it's the cleansing, it's making yourself pure before going to a sacrifice. It's the ritual part of doing this. And so it has all the appearances of being just a sacrifice. It's done in accordance with the law. So verse 6, and so it was when they came that he looked at Eliab and said, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. Now, of course, this is the oldest. He looks the part apparently. And so Samuel is saying, well, this must be the one, right? Well, look what happens. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature. That's exactly what they did with Saul, right? He looked the part. So of the sons of Jesse that Samuel looks at, this must be the guy. Now, this is one of those passages that is incredibly important for us to take a look at and remember it. Because yes, it's the law. Yes, it's a time of the Old Testament covenant of the law. And it is, all those things. It's their history. It's not something that's applied to the church. But this does tell us a lot about how God views the individual. And so we don't, of course, we have the idiom that you don't judge a book by its cover. That's basically the same thing that's going on here. They made that mistake with Saul. It won't be repeated with one of Jesse's sons. So God says to him, don't look at the appearance or the physical stature, because I have refused him. Because here's why. The Lord does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Boy, that's something that's worthy of putting on a refrigerator, isn't it? So as he's saying these things, it's important because we can become sometimes very much impressed with what a person looks like, but in this case, that's not the way that you're going to be picking this person. Well, Jesse's got multiple sons, and so we see here. So then he called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel, and he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. So then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. So thus Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, and Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen any of these. Now imagine being Jesse. Oh, really? You're getting direct communication, son by son here? That must be kind of intimidating. So, verse 11, so Samuel said to Jesse, are all the young men here? And then he said, there remains yet the youngest, and there he is keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes here. And so he sent, brought him in. Now he was ruddy, and ruddy is just a way of saying red. It's his hair. It was the color of his hair, ruddy. And so you find it other places used in the New Testament, or the Old Testament rather, and it's always talking about the look of them. So it's how Esau would have looked. Okay, hairy red, basically is what it was. So it said with bright eyes, and he was very handsome or good looking. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is the one. Now, if you're Samuel, think about this. He doesn't look the part, but remember, God has just told him a moment ago, the Lord looks at the inside, not the outside. Great. God is able to do dynamic things through someone who doesn't look the part, but because he's right on the inside, things work as they're supposed to. So Samuel took the horn of oil, and he anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel arose and went back to Ramah. Now, remember what says here, that the Lord came upon him, not in, but upon, very similar to what he did with Saul. So remember when Saul was first anointed as king, God knew how he was going to do what he did. He warned the people, said, this is not the way I want to do this, but the people insisted, and he allowed it. Now he still did anoint Saul and gave him an ability spiritually that was unusual. But we see that Saul rejected that pretty soon after becoming the king, because he began to just do all kinds of disobedient things, and God wasn't using him any longer. This is the same type of thing that comes upon David at this time. Now, verse 14, but the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a distressing spirit from the Lord troubled him. Now, the wording here is a little bit difficult. At the same time that David is now empowered by the Spirit, God removes his presence, if you will, as a guidance to the king. Does this mean that he abandons Saul? It's not what it is at all. But Saul had been so willful that God is not going to be upon him as king. He's doing that now with David, and that caused great distress to him. But remember, it is Saul who has gotten to the point of rebellion and not listening to God and taking matters into his own hands. And it's an important thing for us to remember. If we're going to insist on doing everything what we want to, and not having that repentance to us, not having that contrition when we break in and do the things that we do, we need to be able to come to him and say, God, I know that you've given me instruction, and I have failed in those instructions. And so, God, forgive me and cleanse me. This is what the believer should be doing at all times, is always evaluating, making sure that things are right between us and the Lord, and that nothing breaks the fellowship that we have with him. Sin is a barrier Doesn't mean that we're unsaved, but we do acknowledge those things and allow that fellowship to be restored. Very much as it was in the Old Testament, it is now an acknowledgement. It's a matter of prayer as we come to him and seek restoration whenever those sinful things happen. So, with that being said, here Saul is left as far as the empowering of the Holy Spirit, and yet at the same time, this is deeply troubling to him spiritually, and God allows these things to take place. If you're going to reject the governance of God, you're going to be dealing with all kinds of other things that happen as he removes his hand from them. This would happen throughout their entire history. It would just be this, it's going to go on for hundreds of years through the kings and then all the way up until the time of Jesus, that they just would have their ups and their downs, that God would say, if you walk with me, I'll be your guide. I'll protect you. I'll have my hand upon you. If you're going to reject me, I'm going to take my hands off, and you're going to have to deal with the consequences. The consequences for Saul here becomes one of mental things. So it doesn't mean that he's demon possessed. That's not the spirit that's being spoken of here. It's rather one of demeanor. How is he coping with this? It becomes more of a mental type of a thing, an emotional type of a thing. So Saul's servants said to him, surely a distressing spirit from God is troubling you. And so it's that from God that makes people struggle with what's being said here. It means that God's allowing this. It's not that God is chastising him and causing him distress and everything else. God's not preventing it from happening. He's troubled in his own mind, but it's a prison of his own making, if you will. So, verse 16, let our master now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who is a skillful player on the harp, and it shall be that he will play with his hand when the distressing spirit from God comes upon you, and you will be made well. And so Saul said to his servants, provide for me a man who can play well, and bring him to me. Then one of the servants answered and said, look, I have seen a son of Jesse from Bethlehem, who is skillful in playing, a mighty man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and handsome, and the Lord is with him. So look at all those things in verse 18. We think of those things as being after the whole Goliath thing. These are things that are already happening to him after his anointing has taken place. Remember that. So there appears to be, from what we get in verse 13 up to verse 14, there seems to be a split of some amount of time, though we don't know. But some amount of time has happened, because he's not just this little kid out, looking at the sheep and seeing to them, though he still has that responsibility, as we're about to see in 17. Some things have happened. This empowering of the Lord has made him be noticed, and not just because he's good with instruments and playing, but also that he is now seen as a man of valor and a man of war and godly. Those are some pretty impressive things that are said, and this is what you would hope that a king would look like. He may not look the part in stature, but that he is valiant, that he is a man that is acquainted or able to combat war, but he's also godly. And so this is who comes to him. Verse 19, therefore Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, send me your son David, who is with the sheep. And it's funny because verse 19, he knows where to go. Whether it's Saul apparently knows, and yet he's forgotten that by chapter 17. He's trying to figure out where he's come from. Well, we'll see when we get there. So Jesse took a donkey, loaded it with bread, a skin of wine, and a young goat, and sent them by his son David to Saul. David came to Saul, stood before him, and loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. So he became very close to Saul, even in the day-to-day of things. It's not just call him whenever I'm having a bad day and have him play some music for me. He got to the inner part. This is, if you're an armor bearer, you're the guy that's around Saul and tending to him. Well, Saul sent to Jesse, saying, please let David stand before me, for he has found favor in my sight. So it's like, not just when I need him, I want him here all the time. So notice, as you have, Saul has no clue what has happened to David already, and it hasn't come, obviously David's probably not going to say anything about that. Jesse knows that Samuel has come and done what he's done, but it's not being spoken of. But what you see is that God has moved all the pieces in place. Though Saul is still the recognized king that the people would see, God has moved the next man in place that is the man of his choosing, and he's in the very court of Saul. Now, why God chose to do it the way he did it, We don't have all those details. Is it that David is able to get kind of a good course, a primer, if you will, on being king? I'm sure that had some benefit to it, but clearly it puts David in a place where he's already understanding the whole king part of it, and he's making obvious lifelong friendships. We're going to see that when we get to chapter 18 with Saul's son Jonathan. So there's all of that that's going on at the same time. And so when I say lifelong friends, remember Jonathan is also going to David's going to outlive Jonathan. We'll see that here as we go. So verse 23, and so it was, whenever the Spirit of God came upon Saul, that David would take the harp, play with his hand, and then Saul would become refreshed and he would be well, and the distressing spirit would depart from him. So it was a soothing kind of a thing. And so this became the friendship that there was initially between Saul and David. Now, it's Saul's own paranoia and all of the troubling that goes on with him that he's going to see David then ultimately become more of a rival. Never should have been that way. That wasn't his intention. David is one who loves and serves Saul. We're going to see all of that. So, chapter 17, we've got the background on David, seeing that he's been anointed as the king, and he has some very interesting attributes and qualities that, it's not something that you necessarily think. Again, by chapter 17, when you think of him standing in front of I almost said Samson, standing in front of Goliath, you get this impression of this incredibly huge, armored up guy, Goliath, and David, just looks like some guy in a tunic, as I mentioned earlier, and like he's, a 12-year-old standing in front of Goliath and throwing rocks at him. That's the children's ministry kind of a thing. But let me read that one more time to you that we have in verse 18 of chapter 16. One of the servants answered and said, "Look, I have seen the son of Jesse, who is skillful in playing, but also a mighty man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a handsome person, and the Lord is with him." So that's the person who is going to confront Goliath. It is because that the Lord is with him that he has a reaction that is different than the rest of the entire army of Israel. And it is why God is able to do the things that he does. Now, in verse 17, now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle and were gathered at Succoth, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Succoth and Azekah in Ephes Damim. So this is from Israel, or from Jerusalem rather. This is to the south. When we go to Israel, we come up through from the Dead Sea. One of our days, we get up in the morning and we leave from the Dead Sea, and we move from east to west, and then we start to travel up north, and we get to Beersheba rather. And as you go up north, you're going to hit a few other places. Bet Shemesh, which we've already talked about back in Samson's time during the book of Judges. But there's also the valley of Elah. And again, they have a pretty good idea. They know where the valley is, but where each of the vantage points are, there's several hills, depending on if you're in kind of the southwest, the northwest, and the northeast. You're going to have these different hills that overlook the valley. We've been to the one that they call Azekah, and that is, if you're looking on a map, it's in the northern part, but it's on the western side of what is the main highway that runs right through this valley. And so you can see there's not the commotion of the 21st century. So in that valley, if people are yelling things and there's the commotion of armies, they're not engaged in battle, but they're arrayed as though they could at any time. Now, it goes on for quite a while, but you can see how all of this would take place, where you could have two large armies ready to go at it, but they never quite engage. That's pretty clear why, because Goliath is taunting and they're all basically in a place of being fearful, but there's no doubt about it that God is holding everything in place until he brings David to bring it to this point. So that kind of sets it for you. Again, take a look on online and you can get an idea where the Valley of Elah is. There's lots of great pictures. If you just do in your search the valley of Elah and Azekah, you'll get an idea. It's a vantage point looking down into the valley. It's pretty impressive to look at. So with all of that said, Saul and the men in verse 2 were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. Now, that would mean that they're standing on the east side of that valley because the Philistines would be coming from the west. Their towns are all along the Mediterranean, which is the westernmost portion of the city or the country of Israel. And basically, they would control about half, almost the 2/3 from the south, all the way where we see now is the Gaza Strip around Egypt, going northward. That was their area. And so the towns that were known by them as their strongholds are still known by those same names today, most of them. So the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side with a valley between them. So as David would be coming, again, if you take a look at the map, you'll notice that David would be coming from Bethlehem, and Bethlehem would be situated a little bit to the northeast of where this would be. And so he'd be coming from where he is at home, coming out to Israel, and he would be coming from behind them. He wouldn't have to go through the Philistines to get there. Again, look at a map, you'll see how everything is situated there. So a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits with and a span, or with a span. Now, depending on what you use as your inches per cubit, let's just say it this way. He's over 8 feet tall and maybe just a little bit under 9 or somewhere close to 9 feet tall. Now, people like to mock that. They think that's ridiculous because they're not looking at these things as it would have been 3,000 years ago. We know that there were giants in that part of the world, as we would call them, giants, and they were kind of a remnant of some other, giants that had lived in the territory. Something for us to remember too, and of course, the world that doesn't believe what the Bible has to say mock this idea, but what was going on in God's original creation and the genetic code of humanity was a whole lot different then, because nothing is the same as it would have been thousands of years ago, because genetically man decays over time. And so the gene pool and all the rest of it goes away from that idea of being better or more perfect, and it goes into a place of decay. So people would look at that and say, well, if that's true, then why is it that man lives longer than he used to in, say, the Middle Ages? And that's pretty obvious, because the way that we eat, the kind of medications that you can take if you're sick, it's just basically we're in a lot of superficial ways prolonging life. But if you believe the Bible is accurate and literal as I do, the idea that they lived hundreds of years, at the closer that you get to the creation, that they lived for those hundreds of years, I have no problems believing that whatsoever, because I do know that it's even a law in what they call the laws of thermodynamics. It's basically that we've heard the saying that there's no such thing as a perpetual motion machine, or it's called entropy. And so for the scientific, everything's going from a place of order to disorder. So everything is breaking down. So the idea that these guys could still be some of them in the genetic code where you would have giants, I don't have a problem with that at all. Makes perfect sense, because I know that the further back you go, the better or more pure the genetic pool would be, and you could still have these kind of things happening. If people hear that and they just want to laugh about that because you don't believe that the Bible's literal, fine, laugh away, no big deal. So, this Goliath, this guy is somewhere between 8 and 9 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And bronze wasn't even, made at this time. It would probably be more like copper or something like that. Now, again, these measurements are things that we can't know for sure exactly what the weight would be, because we don't know what they were using as their weight of measurement, and there are various views of what each would weigh, each measurement would weigh. But this is into the tens or hundreds. Let's suffice to say, by the time that he's all decked out in everything that he had, whether it's his armor, whether it's his weapons or everything else, he would be carrying easily over a couple 100 pounds of armor and everything else. So as big as he is, he probably didn't move very, very fast, and then weigh him down with hundreds of pounds. He would be hard to penetrate it with a sword or with a spear, but he's certainly not going to be very agile. That's helpful to us when we look at David, because he's the total contrast to that. Now, verse 6 says, he had a bronze armor on his legs and bronze javelin between his shoulders. That's more of a breastplate that's being spoken of. Javelin's kind of a poor translation. Now, the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam. Now, that a weaver's beam is what, if you're going to be doing weaving or making something, you would be draping your threads and everything over it. You're going to need to pull down on it. So it's just, think of it as a crossbar kind of a thing of a person who is using it in the way we would think of as a loom. And so it's no small little like broomstick handle. It's like it's some substance. But again, the guy's huge, so his armament would be fitting his stature. So, and it said that the spear weighed 600 shekels, and the shield bearer went before him. The idea, just the tip of his spear, is in excess of 25 pounds. So it gives you an idea. It's a pretty imposing figure. So in verse 8 it says, so he stood and he cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, why have you come out to line up line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? So choose for yourself and let this man come to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, you will be our servants to serve us. So he does this, and you're going to see, he does it continually, day by day. Verse 10, the Philistines said, I defy the army, this Philistine. So Goliath said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And then Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine. They were dismayed. They were greatly afraid. So once again, here's the contrast of the kings. Saul looks the part. He looks like somebody who could do well in battle. He's a big man, bigger than his contemporaries in Israel, and yet he and the rest of the nation is fearful. Okay, so that sets for us the condition of things. Meanwhile, Jesse is back home in Bethlehem, starting to make some plans because he wants to send David to find out what's happening. They've been gone for a while, as we're going to see here, because Goliath has been coming out for more than a month and doing this. So they've been out there a while, and word has not come back to Jesse. Verse 12, now David was the son of the man of Bethlehem in Judah, whose name was Jesse, and he had 8 sons, and the man was old and advanced in years in the days of Saul. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul into battle. The names of his 3 sons were Eliab, the firstborn, and next to him Abinadab, and then the third was Shema. Now David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. So David had been back and forth, it would appear from this, because remember, he's his armor bearer. And so you would figure that he's there, but he's gone back to tend to the things, going back from where they were to the battle that's going on to Bethlehem. There's the back and forth that's taking place. And it says, and the Philistines drew near, and they presented himself, this is Goliath, for 40 days, morning and evening. So this has gone on for well over a month, even from this time when he's going out and doing that. How long they were there before doesn't say. But for 40 days, he has had this same taunt. Morning and night, he says the same things, just taunting them. So, verse 17, then Jesse said to David, take now for your brothers an ephah of this bread, this dried grain, and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp. Carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their thousands, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news to me. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. Now verse 19 apparently is more of Jesse's words to David And it's basically, they've been there for so long, I don't know what's going on. So take these provisions, give them to the people who are there, and this is for everyone that's there, but it's really kind of a reason to make it seem like you're there for a reason, and get me some details. I need to find out what's going on there. So he's wanting to send David on a mission, find out what's happening. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, and took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him, and he came to the camp as the army was going out to fight and shouting for the battle. And Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army, and David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. Then as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the army of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words, so David heard them. Everything changes here. Nothing new. It's the same nonsense that's been going on day after day after day. Here comes Goliath out in front of the entire army, taunting the people of Israel, and it would have been just another day, although it looks as though it's come to a head. They're about to engage. David hears him for this first time from what we see here, because his reaction is totally different. Or the reaction, because David does something. So he talked with him there. I'm sorry, I need to get back to the right verse. So, verse 24, all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and they were dreadfully afraid. Second time we've heard that. So the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who is coming up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. Now, that's very specific, but this is what the men are saying, and David hears it. There are some that would say that they're surmising that that's the case, or maybe that Saul has made this offer. So far, it doesn't even matter how it is that they came to this conclusion or said the things that they're saying. Nobody's willing to take them up on the offer. They're all in this place of being terrified. So David spoke with the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away this reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? There's another, put it on your refrigerator, verse 26, because this is where David looks at this and says, I don't care what the guy looks like. Now, of course, he's heard what it was that, it's basically a way of saying, well, why are you guys so afraid? Now, you have great incentive. If nothing else, it should be great enough incentive that you're the children of Israel and that God would not have this be the case. But now you could get all these other things. Your father's house wouldn't have to pay taxes. You'd get his daughter. You'd get everything that you could ever want. Why is it that you guys are afraid here? So Dave's kind of a little bit in the way of taunting, I believe. And so David then spoke to the men stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine? I love the idea that he says, who is he that he should defy the armies of God? Pretty cool stuff. Verse 27, and the people answered him in this manner, saying, so shall it be done for the man who kills him. So again, David says, let me make sure I understand this properly. It's, again, I think it's a great way of him saying, if this is such a great deal and you guys are so impressed by it, then why haven't you gone and done something about this? Verse 28, now Eliab, this is the oldest brother, David's oldest brother, heard him and spoke to them as he spoke to the men. Eliab's anger was aroused against David, and he said, why do you come down here, and with whom have you left the few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and your presumptuousness is another word for it, and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down just to see battle. You're just here because you're curious. So now think about how dismissive this is. He goes, I understand you're just here for the show and everything else, so who's watching the sheep, kid? It's that way of just the older brother, talking down his younger brother. So here David, again, let's remember what is said about him in chapter 16. He's not just a child anymore. But from an older brother, he's seen the same way. And there seems to be almost a jealousness because he seems to be looking at things a little bit different than everybody else there. They are terrified. Notice that there's no terror in David here. He seems really kind of indignant not only the things that are being said by Goliath, but the fact that they're there listening to it seems to be really troubling to David. So, verse 29, David said, "What have I done now? And is there not a cause?" And so his point was, why the hostility, brother? Why are you saying these things to me? Isn't there a reason why we should all be here? It's kind of that idea of answering back the question with another question. You're asking me, what am I here for? Am I just here out of curiosity? It's like, I haven't done anything to you. Why are you questioning my motives here? Isn't there a reason? So, verse 30. So then he turned from him toward another and said the same thing, and these people answered him as the first ones did. So once again, it becomes that matter of, whoever takes this guy out is going to get all of these things. And so the banter is still kind of going on. Well, now when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. Now, Saul knows who David is. David is his armor bearer. But David's the only guy who is saying anything that seems in the least bit brave or worthy of valor. So oddly enough, Saul knows who he is. So he probably wouldn't look at David and think much of him in the physical appearance. And it's kind of an interesting thing that you don't see Saul trying to say, "Nah, you shouldn't really go." Nobody really does that. Just shows how they're kind of all paralyzed by fear. Obviously, I think it is God who's really moving on all of their hearts, from David saying, "I'm going to go do this," to even preventing the people from giving objection. God's moving in all of these things, I personally believe. So then David said to Saul, here's David to the king, "Let no man's heart fail because of this man," talking about Goliath. "Your servant will go and fight with the Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth." And this is the closest thing that you get to an objection. Thus far, nobody other than his brother, out of probably jealousy or just anger, has said some pretty off the cuff kind of things, but nobody is saying, "You just can't do this. This guy's going to take you out." Saul's the first guy basically who says that. It's David's reply that becomes kind of interesting. So David says to Saul, "Well, your servant used to keep his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it, struck it, and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard, and I struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing that he has defied the armies of the living God." See, God has convinced David that if David is going to engage in this, it is just a matter of going through the motions, because this guy's not going to survive it. He's that sure. Now remember, by this time the Spirit of the Lord has already come upon David. Remember, that happened at his anointing. That's the last chapter. By this time it's gone from Saul. God has removed that from Saul and given it to David. So you see how one acts and the other one reacts? Interesting, huh? So David is able to say, "There's nothing that can deliver this guy from my hand. I'm going down there." But you'll see that they're still thinking, the rest of everybody but David are still thinking military. So verse 37, "Moreover," David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." So Saul clothed David with his armor, put a bronze helmet on his head, and he also clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to the armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, "I cannot walk in these, for I have not tested them." So David took them off. So David's whole thing is, this is not my armor. If it was something that was on Saul, which some of it appears that as though it was, it wouldn't have fit him. They're totally different body structure. Saul's the biggest guy on the block, and David's one of the smaller. So David just basically says this is an encumbrance. Now think about this. God makes him prepared for this battle because he is totally different than Goliath. Goliath is so filled with armor on the front of him, making conventional war against him would be difficult, but he'd be kind of just lumbering and cumbersome, where David is just nimble. He's able to do whatever. He has nothing to slow him down. Pretty interesting. So Verse 40, so he took his staff in his hand. He chose for himself 5 smooth stones in the brook, and he put them in a shepherd's bag in the pouch which he had, and a sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. Now in verse 40, I've heard a lot of people do Bible studies on this, and they say the 5 stones that he took was for Goliath's other brothers. Well, nothing in here gives the indication that David would have known that Goliath had brothers. He just took what was there. There were 5 stones. So, if people want to try to see something symbolic in that, that's fine. They can think that. Why is it 5? Why is it mentioned? Doesn't really say. What we do know is he only needed 1, and we don't see him doing anything else with it, the sling, that particular day that he would have needed the extra stones. He just grabs 5. So, why we have the number doesn't say. Does he use them all? Nope. Looks like he just does it with 1. So he took the staff in his hand, the stones, verse 41. So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. So Goliath doesn't have a shield. His armor bearer is there. He's going down to meet David. It's just supposed to be the 2 of them. Goliath, though he has all of the things that are on his body, doesn't have his shield. So when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good looking. So the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his God. Interesting that he would say that, because again, it's what is the outward appearance. Goliath's whole thing is, what do you think I'm a dog that you would send this guy out to me? This is almost embarrassing that you would do this. This is more of his taunting. Well, we already know how the story turns out, but it's just kind of funny to look at it like this. So the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This in verse 45, it really tells you, if you didn't even know how this was going to turn out, that's just told you. You don't even have to know. David has basically said, you're coming to me with all the things that people think should win a battle. I'm coming to you with the only way to make sure of it. God has sent me here. This day, David says, I will deliver you into, the Lord will deliver you into my hand. I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, and all the earth will know that there is a God in Israel. Then all the assembly will know that the Lord does not save with the sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what we should understand, no matter what it is. And in this case, it is hand-to-hand combat, David and Goliath. But what we need to realize is that when God is involved in the whole, back and forth of things, if we know that we go forward in his power, it is not the earthly circumstances that factor in. God will do what he will do in the way that he wants to do it. Doesn't always factor in the way that man would do it. In fact, oftentimes it's totally the opposite, so that man cannot ever take any kind of credit for it because it's too improbable. So again, put these guys next to each other. Here's David with a sling and a staff. Has something, sharp enough to cut with, probably. But what he doesn't have is all the armor. That's all on Goliath. It's the big guy against the smaller man. Everything would tell you how this is going to turn out. But what we just read there, verses 45 and 46, is going to make it obvious, and 47, how this is all going to work out. But let's read it nonetheless. So it was when the Philistines arose, or the Philistine, Goliath, arose, and he came and he drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand into his bag, took out the stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in the forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. Now, again, remember, it doesn't have to be fanciful. David is running at this point, which is pretty interesting because it is, it's the terrain that it is. It's in a valley. Who knows? Now it's been done farming in it and everything else. Who knows what it looked like at the time? We know that there was a stream running through it. So did he meet him on flat ground? Did he meet him on the incline? You really can't tell for sure. It doesn't tell us. It just tells us that David went running towards him to meet him. As he's on the run, he grabs one of the stones out of his bag and he throws it, and it hits Goliath to the point where it says that it sunk into his head. It means that it would have broken his skull. And so obviously it knocked him out. So did it kill him on impact? Hard to say. It doesn't matter because he's not able to put up any kind of a fight, and we know what David does next. Now, I've heard a lot of Bible studies done on this, and I heard one say it that I thought was really pretty funny. David was obviously accomplished with this, but if he wasn't, if he was just the type that would have not known really how well to throw it, it doesn't matter where he would have released it, that stone was going to find Goliath's head. May God bless you. That's what somebody had said. I thought that's a good insight. I agree with that, because it wasn't David throwing the stone as much as it was God throwing the stone. David knew for sure he could not lose this battle because God had already confirmed to him, you're going to go win this thing. You're going to do this thing. He had that assurance knowing that God is going before him. So there is Goliath, face to the ground. We hear nothing about his armor bearer. That nothing mentioned about that to this point. So so David prevailed, verse 50, over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him, but there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran, and he stood over the Philistine, took his sword, and drew it out of his sheath, and he killed him and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Now, I realized I misspoke earlier. The stone, when he threw it, embedded into him and it knocked him. He was unconscious. I think I had said, whether he was dead or unconscious. He was clearly unconscious because it says that David killed him using Goliath's sword and then removed the guy's head from him. Pretty gruesome stuff. So David ran, stood over the Philistine, took his sword and drew it out of its sheath, killed him and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Now, the men of Israel, the men of Judah, they arose, they shouted, they pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley and to the gates of Ekron, one of their fortified cities. And the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to Sharaim, and even as far as Gath and Ekron. And so the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their tents. So total wipeout of everything. David took the head of the Philistine, brought it to Jerusalem, and he put his armor in his tent. So he took the spoils that were there. And Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, and he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, as your soul lives, O king, I do not know. This is kind of a hard thing for me to wrap my mind around, because he's already been told when Saul, unless he's just totally out of his mind when he's told it at first in chapter 16, there is this man of Benjamin, Jesse, and he has a son. And so that's that verse 18 that we looked at in the last chapter, and the verses right before it. So for some reason, nobody seems to remember all of that. So the king said, inquire whose son this young man is. Then David returned from the slaughter of the Philistines. Abner took him, brought him before Saul, with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? So David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem. So again, it's hard to tell. Why is it that Saul doesn't remember all these things? Is it part of his madness? What is the case? Why? But he wants to know who he is and what he's about. Now, chapter 18 is going to go into the way that he strikes up a friendship with Saul's son Jonathan. And again, this particular part of the study, the whole book begins to change, because now it's going to be, David is going to be seen as a rival by Saul. Because people are starting to pay attention to him. You'll see all of that, and it's part of that paranoia and whatever's going on with him in his mind. Saul is really, really in a very troubled place, and it will explain why he does the things towards and directed at David that he does when David means him no harm. So with all that said, we'll pick that up next week. Jonathan now gets mentioned into the whole thing, and that will again start to show how the relationship between Saul and David and the house or the family of Saul, how that all starts to work out. It's a pretty interesting study, but there we have chapter 16 and 17. Again, we went through a lot of information here. If you're having trouble finding any of the maps when you look online, send me an email, let me know. I can help you get some. I can maybe even send some to you if you'd like, but not too hard to find. Remember Valley of Elah, and there's lots that you can find online. It's pretty easy to see. If you have any other questions about the study, you know how to contact us. You can do so through the website of the ministry, which is oldpaththeology.net. And there's an email that you can send there. I'd be happy to answer your questions. And as always, if you're watching this on YouTube, we are always putting out content, so you're always welcome to contact us through the email. And again, the YouTube channel, you can subscribe there, and you'll be able to get the information about the studies that we do. So until next week, we pick up at chapter 18.